Chapter 4. There's No Place Like Home. I took the news hard. David said I didn't talk much for days, and that when I did, a huge piece of me was simply not there. But in the weeks that followed, well, I didn't have time for self-pity. There were repairs to be made, seeds to be planted, and skills to be bartered. I guess the sorrow played itself out and was drowned in the sheer amount of work to be done. I survived. Somehow I even survived understanding that there would be no answers, no bodies to lie to rest. But it hurt so bad. It still does. Their loss haunts me to this day. I guess it will forever. Jess's Journal. It was a beautiful, warm spring day. It had rained last night, a big, booming thunderstorm with wild winds and strong rain. By the time the sun rose in the morning, the clouds reduced to wisps, drifting high in the clear blue sky. There was no wind now, not even a real breeze, and the earth was already warming. Spring had come early again this year, and summer was close on its heels. Already finished with their blooming, the jonquils and tulips were now making way for the iris. The grass was green and lush where it had been left to grow wild, and already rows of lettuce and other greens were ready for harvest. A few feet away, Tina was quietly picking strawberries. From the looks of it, more of them were ending up in her belly than in the basket. Jess pushed into the rich, loamy soil with her bare hands, setting in the last of the bush beans she had been given and pulling at the opportunistic weeds. Beneath all of the neglect, there was richness waiting. This soil was dark and loose in her hands, and the weeds came out easily when pulled. So many years of love and attention would trump the 1.5 years of abandonment. She thought of her mother, Julie, hair piled up on top of her head, streaks of gray flying in wisps, and a halo of stray hairs around her head. Her hands had dug deep in the dirt, just as Jess's hands did now. Those memories of her mother struck so often. Julie Aronson lived on in this garden, and it gave her daughter bittersweet memories of her each day. Here in the yard, shaping, digging, planting, and weeding, Julie had poured her heart and soul into the rich loam. She had done her best to make this tiny patch of suburbia into a green paradise, despite her lawn-loving neighbors. Jess remembered as a child that their neighbors would look at the family's trellises, fruit and nut trees, and raised beds and shake their heads. They would mow their perfectly green, dandelion-free lawns and talk among themselves, convinced that the Aronsons were just a little on the odd side. That had all changed after Black Monday. When times had gotten tough, they had changed their tune and the rest of the neighborhood had transformed. Victory gardens had once again become vogue and sprung up in every yard, even the unoccupied ones. Julie Aronson had taught class after class to their neighbors, and even to scores of city dwellers from the surrounding metro, who were all eager to learn how to raise their own fruits and vegetables. She had readily passed on her knowledge of composting, companion planting, cooking with fresh herbs, and more. Jess's dad, Michael, had even caught the teaching bug and enthusiastically educated scores on how to construct and install rain barrels, build raised beds, and even, Jess grinned at the memory of the students' faces, how to compost human feces in buckets of sawdust. That last one had been a real winner. Jess's mom had even begun writing a book on gardening in Missouri. This had become difficult when the power started going out regularly. She had begun writing notes longhand, muttering over the order of the pages, and asked Jess for help with sketching the different plants. That had all changed when the Western Front troops had marched through, cutting through the streets, ransacking, burning, and taking whatever and whoever they wanted. It seemed that most of their neighbors had not made it. The yards and the pitiful remnants of their victory gardens were now full of weeds and lay untended. Half of the houses on their block had burned to the ground, and most of the others were badly damaged. Jess's home was one of only 2 still standing. It was eerily quiet. Jess kept listening for the sound of a mower, but there was not a sound to be heard but the birds and a distant hammering. Probably old Mr. Banks. He had said his shed needed a new roof. She reviewed the list of projects in her head. Fix the northeast corner of the roof, install more raised beds, prepare chicken coop, till the south side of the house, and plant a crop of corn. Each morning she and David sat at the table in the kitchen and discussed the priorities for the day. Tina was good at fetching and carrying small items, and she would watch Jacob in a pinch, but it was Jess and David who shouldered the burden of getting the mountain of tasks done. The townspeople had helped them enormously. They had dipped into the community stores and brought them jars of food, most of it grown fresh and canned the year before. The town was in better shape than any others they had encountered along the way, as well-armed and organized. Jess and David were required to put in time with the local militia each week, patrolling the outskirts of the town for intruders, much as Thurman Banks had been doing the day they arrived. There was a schedule posted on Main Street, and everyone adhered to it faithfully. Their survival, individually and as a community, depended on it. Visitors to Belton were rare, but a returning ender was rarer still. The ones taken by the troops that bleak day, now 18 months past, had not come back. If they had, it had been soon after. Wounded, they had trickled in, half dead, starving. Most had died within days of their return. The town's inhabitants had kept themselves alive by retreating from the rest of the world. They let in the odd trader, watched them at all times, and sent them on their way quickly. Any strange soldier was drawn down on and shot if he did not leave immediately. It also helped that Belton had nothing that anyone else might want, at least not visibly. Well hidden from sight, they had a plethora of cropland and seed, and several large herds of cattle. In this new world, they were well placed. This area of Missouri had a decent growing season and an excellent water supply. With fertile land and livestock, there was plenty to trade. Part of the roof, damaged in a recent storm, was actively leaking. Farley, who had been a banker and was now mayor, told her that it would have to wait until the crops were in the ground before fixing it. "You can't depend on handouts," he admonished her, as if he were speaking to a child. "You will have to make sure and produce enough food for you and yours to eat." Jess refrained from pointing out that they had been surviving on their own for well over a year, and rather well at that, without his patronizing advice. Still, she had to admit that he was right. The repairs to the house would have to wait until the means for survival were well in hand. Meanwhile, to minimize the damage any rainfall might do, they draped a tarp over the affected area and held it in place with landscaping stones. Jess's dad, an avid home brewer, had planted hop plants along the entire length of the south side of the house. Already they were beginning to emerge from the ground. By summer they would wind their way up the trellis mounted to the walls of the house. The vines would reach all the way to the roof of the house, and then, a few weeks later, the first of the hop flowers would emerge. Jess figured they would be a good item to trade to those interested in brewing beer. She would keep some, as according to Madge's notes, the flowers could be used for stimulating appetite, and also as a sedative. The rest of the south side of the property they tilled and planted with corn. When the corn emerged and grew to 1/2 foot, Jess would plant beans and squash at the base of each stalk, an ancient method of companion planting known as the Three Sisters. Madge had spoken of this planting method, and Jess wanted to try it and see how successful it was. By fall, they should have a lot of canning to do. The backyard of the house was fenced, and Jess and the kids planted peas and beans along the entire perimeter, stapling chicken wire to the base of the fence for the plants to climb on. She realized, as she walked through the front yard, that many of the plants her mother had growing in it were actually herbs or beneficial wild edibles. Here was wild carrot, yarrow, and lemon balm. Madge had filled a handwritten journal, and Jess's head with all kinds of details on how these plants could be used. Some were good for eating, others eased nausea, relieved menstrual cramps, and still others had antibiotic or healing properties. Jess knelt on the ground, loosening the dirt around an emerging plant. This one was foxglove, also known as digitalis, a powerful heart stimulant. It was dangerous in just about any quantity. Madge had said that even nibbling the leaves could kill you. Jess debated on whether or not to keep it. Everything in the gardens and yard had to have a purpose. Mainly that purpose was to ensure the survival of her little family. She worried that Jacob would get into it. He would be walking in a few more months, and she had to think of what would be safe or not. As she debated, Tina walked over, hands caked with mud. "What you doing?" "Trying to decide what to do with this plant." The little girl knelt beside her. "Grandmother showed me this one. It's called digitalis." "Digitalis?" Jess asked. "Yes, digitalis." The girl didn't miss a beat. "For the heart. Don't eat it," she recited, proud that she was able to remember. At 4, the little girl's memory was unbelievable. She could remember hundreds of plants, their names, and their uses. Jess smiled. "That's right, teen, very good." She gave the little girl a hug. "But we don't need something like that. Maybe I should just dig it up and get rid of it. I wouldn't want Jacob getting his hands on it and eating it." Tina shook her head. Her mouth was streaked with red juice and tiny black dots of the strawberries she had eaten. Despite this, the basket was heaping with strawberries. "We should keep it, Jess, so's we can be doctors and takes care of people when they're sick. Put a fence round it, a metal one like you got on the big fence." Jess looked at the girl with confusion for a moment, until she realized Tina was referring to the chicken wire. Putting chicken wire around it made sense. She grabbed the rest of the roll and cut a piece that was big enough to prevent a short little baby hand from reaching the plant, and placed it around the emerging plant. "Good idea, sweetie." She looked over at the girl again and asked, "So, you want to be a doctor?" Tina nodded solemnly. "I am going to be a doctor. Then I can go and fix Mama and Daddy and Aaron and Grandmother, and they can live with us again." Jess winced in pain. She thought of her own parents. Then she hugged Tina close to her again. If the kid wanted to be a doctor, so be it. It sounded good to her. Jacob gave a small squawk beneath his blanket. She had laid him between 2 layers of blanket next to her on the ground while he slept, but now he was awake and kicking. Tina gave a small crow of happiness. She loved holding Jacob, which made Jess a little nervous since she was so small, and he was a hefty 15 pounds or so now. "Can I hold him? Can I hold him?" She danced up and down with excitement. She deflated like a popped balloon when Jess shook her head. "You're all muddy, kiddo." The little girl's sad expression was hard to take, so Jess continued. "Later, sweetie, after you have washed up." She dusted off her hands, picked up her son and cooed at him. He grinned back at her, his wide smile showing the one lone tooth in his mouth, and then he shoved his entire fist into his mouth. "Come on, Jacob. You and me and Tina need to fix some lunch and figure out what to plant next." The baby gurgled happily in response. The rest of the front yard was slated to become an orchard. Already they had 3 trees, 2 peach and 1 apple, and Mr. Banks had come by a week earlier to tell her he had several 3-foot apricot and apple saplings ready to transplant.
"They'll take a while, Jess,"
the old man warned her.
"A few years at least before you have any to harvest."
He came by regularly, bringing them extra items that would help make their lives easier, even volunteering to help with the roof later when it was time for repairs. Yes, I remember my dad planting the peach trees. She looked up at them, noted the blooms, and hoped they would get a lot of peaches. I'll look forward to getting those and planting them, Mr. Banks. What can I give you in trade? This was a phrase she had learned quickly. The jars of food, supplies of any kind, she had learned that these things came with a price. It was normal practice to ask what another would want in trade for such things. She had come to understand that even the food they had been given when they first arrived must be paid back. It made sense. For the community to survive, they were given a helping hand, but they were expected to return the favor as soon as they were able. Mr. Banks had looked uncomfortable when she asked the question. He'd looked at the ground with his big hands stuck in his overalls and shuffled his feet. After much hemming and hawing, he had managed to explain that he was lonely. His wife Mary had died right before the invasion. His son Mark had died on the day of the invasion. His daughter-in-law, Alan's mother Annette, was gone in the fire that had leveled his son's home, and his only grandchild, Alan, was long missing and his whereabouts were unknown. He had everything he needed to survive, extra even, and knew that Jess and her little family had a struggle ahead of them. They struck up an arrangement of sorts where he would bring by what he could spare, and she would fix him dinner and let him spend time with her and the kids.
"Someday I'll be gone, Jess, and if Alan never returns, well..."
He left the rest of it unfinished, but she understood him. All that was his would be hers if his grandson didn't come home, and as much as she appreciated his offer, Jess fervently prayed for the umpteenth time that Chris and Alan had made it out and were holed up somewhere or heading home even now. As she walked to the north gate, she glanced at the saplings, 6 in all, and smiled. In a few years, they would help shade the east side of the house from the hot morning sun and begin to produce fruit. She was looking forward to making peach preserves and pie. Through the north gate, she ran into David. He had turned 12 3 weeks ago and announced he was a man now. His reasoning was simple. Jess was mom and matriarch, so he had to step up to the plate and be the patriarch. He had actually used those very words. Jess maintained a straight face, restraining from laughing with some effort. Later, it hit her that the kid was right in some crazy sense of things. When other Enders came by, they spoke to Jess or David with a level of equality they were unused to from adults. Mayor Farley was the only one who treated them like children or felt free to lecture them. The brutal fact of the matter was that everyone was too damned busy struggling to survive. It didn't matter how young or old you were, merely that you were competent. It was what you did, how you carried yourself, and what responsibilities you took on that dictated how others perceived you. In the years that would follow, through acne and hormonal surges, David would earn that level of respect of his neighbors and the townsfolk through his hard work and courage. He had his arms full of old tools and was struggling with the side door to the garage. "What you doing?" Tina asked her big brother as she opened the door for him. "Organizing the tools and getting them oiled. Mr. Banks said they'd last longer that way." "We have oil?" Jess asked. "Yeah, the stuff that turned rancid from the heat, that big tub of peanut oil." He dumped the tools onto the floor of the garage and said, "Might as well use it for something." "It's gonna stink." "I can handle it." Jess grinned. She had watched him throw himself at projects around the house since they had arrived, always with that dogged determination to show no weakness. She wondered where it was coming from. Why did he feel the need to prove himself? Was it because he was worried that some part of her still thought of him as a kid? It wasn't particularly fair of her. 4.5 years difference wasn't a very long time. They were both still children when measured to the standards of before. She reminded herself again to not slip up and call him kid again like she had 2 days ago. He deserved better from her. "I'm gonna fix some sandwiches. You want one?" she asked. "Sure." "Wash the oil off before you come in." "Okay." There was no electricity in the house. Come winter, they would be dependent on the stove and the fireplace for heat. The rapidly approaching summer was of far more concern to Jess. No air conditioning during the hottest days meant stewing and muggy 90-plus degree heat. If the mild winter was any indication, the summer promised to be a scorcher. Jess had mastered the art of nursing while in motion. Jacob nursed contentedly against her in a wrap, while she cut slices of cheese off of a block Tina fetched from the cool basement, laid them on thick slices of homemade bread, and added a dollop of pickled vegetables that they had received from the community stores. David walked in, wiping his wet hands on his pants. He ladled a cup of lukewarm chicory from the pan on the stove into a cup. He sipped and screwed up his face. Wish we had some sugar." "You'll have to suffer until this fall. Mr. Banks gave me some heirloom albino beet seed last week, and it's good for making sugar." "So you planted all of the seeds?" "Almost. Got the okra, squash, cucumbers, and more lettuce in. Oh, the collards, carrots, and bush beans, too. I didn't figure you wanted me messing with the herbs or the pumpkins or pole beans, but everything else is done. We'll want to keep at least 2 to 3 plants from each crop to use for seeds next year. Maybe more, 'cause Mayor Farley says they're going to start asking for contributions to the community seed bank in late summer." Jess handed him a sandwich, and he took a huge bite. Then his next words were impossible to understand as he tried to talk around the food in his mouth. Jess snapped, "Don't talk with your mouth full. Now, what did you just say?" David rolled his eyes, chewed and swallowed. "Geez, who died and appointed you Mom? I said that I wanted to go hunting. I'm hoping to get us a good-sized deer." "Well, if you want good-sized, you're going to have to wait. They're all still skinny runts after winter. Besides, after planting, we need to get started on some of these repairs. And," she said loudly as David began to object, "I need you to figure out how to fix the chicken coop and build a chicken tractor. Mr. Banks said he's going to bring us by some pullets so we can restart our own flock." "Baby chickens?" Tina's interest was piqued. She set her sandwich down and Jess noticed her hands were still crusted with dried mud. "Can I take care of them?" "Not if you can't remember to wash your hands before you eat," was Jess's brisk reply. "Go wash those hands right now." She finished the last word with a howl as Jacob bit into her breast with his new tooth. The baby was so startled by her shriek that he let go and began to wail. As Jess swore and yelled, Tina and David exchanged looks and quickly disappeared outside, sandwiches in hand. Quincy trotted past them, heading for a shady spot in the yard. Even the dog knew when to make herself scarce. They sat outside, near the small pond, and finished their lunch. Little of the sizable yard had grass in it. Instead, there were planters rising from the ground, filled with small sprouts and dark, rich earth. All of the beds had been weeded now, and the weeds piled in the far corner of the yard near the damaged chicken coop. This place felt good, well defended, thanks to the town militia. For the first time since leaving the cave, David felt safe. It wasn't home yet, but it would be in time. The 4 of them would make this a home, and defend it if necessary. As they sat, ate, rested, and daydreamed, the clouds began to gather in the west. Later that afternoon, a heavy, life-giving rain began to fall, wetting the newly turned soil and waking the seeds from their slumber. That evening, miles to the south, the storm was fully engaged over the pitiful remains of a ghost town once known as Clinton. A mile outside of the ruined town, a woman screamed. Lightning flashed and rain dripped through the roof of a dilapidated house. Serena screamed at the top of her lungs for anything that could stop the pain. As Brad held her hand, he could see the baby's head crown, then disappear back up. Another push and scream, and the head and shoulders appeared. He let go of Serena's hand and reached down to cradle the tiny head, holding the baby as it slid out and coughed. A sharp, thin wail issued from its mouth. He looked past the umbilical cord. "It's a girl. Baby, we got ourselves a little girl." He smiled through his disappointment. He'd wanted a boy, but a girl was fine. What bothered him most was the baby's jet-black hair and ice-blue eyes. He wiped her down, cut the cord, wrapped the tiny baby in a clean blanket, and handed her to Serena, who looked both excited and exhausted. The lightning lit up the room and the baby squawked in fear at the loud thunderclap. Serena took in the baby's features and met Brad's steady gaze. He smiled again, reached out and stroked Serena's cheek. "She's beautiful. What should we name our baby?" Relief washed over her. "My mother's name was Rebecca. We'll call her Becca for short." "Becca it is." Brad held Serena close and kissed her hair. Serena Kearney was a beautiful woman. Her blonde hair was a mess, and he could see she'd closed her beautiful blue eyes in exhaustion. It had been a long labor, and she'd been so frightened. Brad eased away from her, stood up, and lit a lantern. They were safe here, he was sure of it. Max and Annie were asleep in one of the upstairs rooms. He headed for the dark hallway and pitch-black bathroom, lighting the way with the lantern. His reflection gave him a start. They'd been on the road and away from mirrors so much that he'd grown used to not having one. He ran his hand through his light brown hair, peered in the mirror at his eyes, which burned and felt bloodshot. Damn, it had been a long birthing. He'd read up on it, so he wouldn't be a complete fool, but it had been hard for both of them. He stretched, relieved himself in the dry, filthy toilet, and thought about the baby. Becca. He'd figured it wasn't his, but it hurt in some strange way seeing the truth. He'd paid at least some attention in science class back in high school. Serena was blonde. His hair was light brown. His eyes were brown. Serena's were this gorgeous deep blue. You didn't make a black-haired, ice-blue-eyed baby with that combination. For just those few moments, he allowed his thoughts to turn dark. That bastard. Raping women, always blonde, always blue-eyed. Raping them over and over until he filled them full of his seed, and then, when they showed, he killed them. What kind of monster does that? His hands curled into fists at the thought. He picked up the lantern and headed back to the living room where Serena and the baby lay sleeping. For just a moment, he thought of killing the child. Cooper was far away, too far away and too damned powerful to kill, but he could. Brad felt his fingers clenching into fists. A moment passed. Then the thought of wrapping his hands around her and choking her to death made him shiver. What was he thinking? The tiny creature whined slightly in her sleep. Black hair and blue eyes. The child was beautiful. even freshly born and red and a little bit squashed looking. Brad shook his head, cleared it of the dark thoughts, and smiled. He imagined her smile, thought of how it would sound to hear her say, "Daddy," and reached down and stroked her cheek. Her tiny head turned and rooted for his finger. He smiled. "Hi, Becca. I'm your daddy." He could have sworn she smiled.